It is certainly true that there are topographic details of Mars. I and my computer are the first person to have ever seen them, and probably will be the only person to ever see them, which is, it's a big data set, right? But making things, it's a calling, it's almost a priesthood in a way, but we have not yet figured out a general solution for mass production for anything.
What has been the hardest technical challenge you guys have overcome, and how did you kind of engineer around it?
In 10 years, it's a moot point because Terraform Industries and friends will be synthesizing all that oil and gas anyway, and it'll be locally produced.
We're here in Burbank with Casey Handmer of Terraform Industries inside of their exciting and very, very busy shop floor, chemistry lab,
Snack storage place.
Yeah. And we just filmed the Terraform first Terraform episode for S3. We went through a lot. We made the decision to make it a longer than normal episode in editing. So we'll see how that goes. But I have some questions for you.
Of course.
My first question is, you have a pretty interesting background, to say the least. You know, from studying Caltech, working on Hyperloop One, which is obviously a famed thing.
Yeah.
Doing stuff at JPL, unclear what. But I guess, can you give me a quick walkthrough of your background and what you did during these times that you're most proud of, looking back?
Yeah, sure. So I came out to the United States in 2010 to study at Caltech, did a PhD in theoretical physics there. It's very esoteric. You can read my thesis and look for evidence of plagiarism if you want. But it was, I'm quite proud of what I achieved there within its bounds. But also what I achieved was realizing that I didn't want to be a theoretical physicist professor anymore. So around 2015, I wrapped up, defended, got my ticket, walked across the stage, and fortunately had been introduced to someone who worked at Hyperloop by a woman who later became my wife. So yeah, it's a good strategy. Good job finding strategy, yeah. So at Hyperloop at that time, they're basically trying to make Elon Musk's white paper real. Elon was not involved at Hyperloop One, but a lot of his very early employees at SpaceX came on board there to start that company and try and make a go of it. And it was kind of one of these interesting things, almost quixotic in a way, because we kind of knew signing up that it was basically impossible. But we thought if we tried hard enough, we'd find out how impossible it was. And we solved hundreds of really tough problems, but ultimately not enough of them. We were kind of defeated by reality. But it was a great opportunity to kind of get my feet wet, learn how to be a less useless person, figure out how startups work, learn about how engineering works, learn about mechanical engineering at all, do a bunch of calculations, just get really freaking smart about a new thing. My role there kind of evolved over time. Initially, I was doing some magnetic levitation stuff, but eventually I got to work in basically every single part of the company, including on the business side, which is just an incredible privilege. At one point, they flew me out to Vladivostok to talk at the East Asian Economic Conference or something like that, which was super exciting. That's actually the third time I'd been to Vladivostok, and also the most recent. But it was a great opportunity to go there with my little sister as well. Actually, she came along, and just really kind of showed me what was possible. You can kind of manifest this technology.
It sounds like you're sort of like a classic spin out from academic background, studying, to then going in, like, working on a crazy company like that. What did you approach? Like, was that kind of the intent? Was like, how do I go from being more theoretical to being more?
Well, at the time, I just needed a job in a hurry. Under U.S. immigration law, which I will add for reference, is completely insane, and we should definitely change. You can basically earn your PhD or your master's degree essentially at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer, and then unless you can find a job in like a couple of months, you will be deported. Right? Thanks for coming. Here's your degree. Now bugger off, which is insane, right? Particularly for the STEM fields, right? Because I had numerous colleagues, Chinese and Russian and Iranian or whatever, who had basically come to the United States because they loved the United States and they wanted to work here. And essentially, on pain of persecution, they were forced to go back to their home countries, where they subsequently, in some cases, were forced to work on weapons systems that they did not want to work on. Like, this is just dumb. We should Operation Paperclip these people here straight away. Okay. End of rant for now. Anyway, I managed to get a job there. And then while I was working there, I managed to get a green card as well, which was kind of the major step. Once you have a green card, you basically, things are under control. But with a green card, I was also able to work in aerospace, and it had always been a dream of mine to work at JPL. There's no secret of this. I've interviewed at SpaceX multiple times. I've interviewed at JPL multiple times. Eventually at JPL, they finally relented and let me in. And I started there in, I think, early 2018, just before I started a family, and had a great time. It's an incredible place. Again, like, just an opportunity. What an opportunity to, like, go and learn at the best place from the best people. This was like 3 for 3. I'd be like Caltech, Hyperloop One, which is full of SpaceX refugees, and then JPL, which is the one place on Earth that reliably operates multiple robots on other planets. Just nuts.
What did you work on there?
So nothing too glamorous, unfortunately. My main area was I was in the group that did GPS science and applications. So these are people who started out long ago using pulsars to measure continental drift and then upgraded that to doing GPS. This is before selective availability was turned off. So they were able to kind of get around that when in the old days GPS was not too accurate. They figured out ways of making it more accurate. And eventually the what is now the Space Force said, okay, guys, you need to help us now. So that was pretty cool to get to work on some of these receivers that had been developed in some cases in the late 80s, early 90s and were still being operated. And I can't specify exactly how good they were, but they were very good. And it got to work with a bunch of really smart people on a variety of interesting questions. I think over 4 years, I worked on 15 projects. 5 of them delivered successfully. 5 of them kind of fizzled out, and 5 of them were still in progress when I left. I was not the only person working on them, obviously, but I also got to get my feet wet on some interesting AI related problems. Which actually one of them started a project that I just finished last week, which took me a very, very long time with kids and stuff to finally finish. Which was there's this incredible data set from the context camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the entire planet Mars, which is somewhat smaller than the Earth, but it's still a goddamn planet. It's huge at 5-meter resolution, which is a big data set, right? So 16-bit uncompressed TIFFs, it is 9 terabytes, which is a lot of data. And I figured out how to use that optical imagery to enhance the altimetry data, the topographic data that we already had, which prior to this point was about 460-meter resolution. And now my data set is 7-meter resolution. So
cool. Congratulations on that wrapping up.
I'm very, very happy about that. It's been a big project. It did take my poor little old school GPU about 2 months to crunch all those numbers, but now I have that data. I just have to figure out what to do with it.
It's like that makes me think of like the map. I always think about map makers, like when we were, kind of humans were first beginning, or I should say the West was sort of first beginning to discover the Americas and such, and like how the detail and time you must have taken to draw these maps. But you, in like these first early maps.
Oh, it's so much easier to make maps with satellites.
But you still were one of these first people from Mars, which I think is very cool.
So it's certainly true that there are topographic details of Mars where I and my computer are the first person to have ever seen them, and probably the only person to ever see them. There's a handful of regions of Mars that have been mapped at extremely high resolution using stereo methods in areas where rovers are driving around and stuff. But for the vast majority of the planet, it's essentially terra incognita until now. And the reason I did this was that the next step is to do a global hydrology simulation, basically reconstruct all the rivers and creeks and stuff that historically flowed on Mars, and basically map those features, which you can see them optically. They're there. Just got to turn the rain back on in the computer and see where the rivers and oceans and stuff end up, and then render it, and then show the world how beautiful this planet will be once we're done terraforming it. And that will, of course, force people to realize that this is something that has to be done. It's my secret plan. The Terraform Industries has nothing to do with that, of course.
Speaking of realizing things that have to be done, when did the kernel of the idea for Terraform kind of plant in your mind, and when did you make the decision?
Yeah.
What was that decision to go full-time with it like?
Well, there's a short version and a long version, and I may as well tell the long version here, but essentially I realized a long time ago, probably around the same time I came out to the United States, that we would be unable to do much in the way of progress unless we could unlock the various problems that had kind of locked up in the 70s. What happened in 1971? Well, a bunch of basically existing systems locked into place. And the key unlock to solve that problem, which was inspired, I will add, by the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, was the key unlock was to basically come up with a better way of getting energy. I mean, it doesn't sound very profound once you say it like that. But at the time I was like, well, what's that going to, maybe I should work on fusion or something. And very quickly after that, I cottoned on, in particular, thanks to the writings of Remez Nam, to the fact that solar was getting cheaper faster than anyone could explain or understand then, and it's still the case now. Every, well-spoken, supposedly well-qualified analyst who tries to predict how much solar will be deployed and how cheap it's going to get is always wrong. Massively wrong.
Is it like a Moore's Law thing? Like what's...
Yeah, I mean, essentially. But like Moore's Law is like trust the curve. Well, it's not really an explanatory power to taking Moore's Law and then just kind of extrapolating, right? You have to understand why, if you reduce the cost by 10%, you'll increase demand by 20%. If you increase demand by 20%, you can increase production by 20%. If you increase production by 20%, you'll lower the cost by 11%, right? And so if you're able to lower the cost by more than the marginal increase in demands the increase in production, you have this extremely positive feedback loop that then just accelerates. And that's what we're seeing right now. But I don't think that's really well understood. I would say that it's generally not understood at all. Most people are not even aware of it, let alone...
I will admit that I did not know that that's how Moore's laws work, but it makes way more sense. It feels more like
Well, it more or less the same kind of feedback system.
Feels more like a real-time strategy game than I always thought it was like a physics kind of principle thing.
Well, so that's on the demand side, right? So if we are able to deliver, a 20% cost premium or a 10% cost premium as a result of a 20% production increase, then this will continue to accelerate. Then you look on the supply side and you say, is it possible to further continue to reduce the cost of solar panels, assuming ongoing enormous investments in production technology? And the answer historically has been yes, obviously. And in the future, the answer is still yes, obviously. Because if you look at current solar panels, they're still just heart-achingly primitive, right? It's like Flintstones level bang rocks together to make them. We literally take silicon, we refine it 3 times, and then we draw out these giant ingots, cut it up with a diamond saw, and put stuff. It's like, what are we doing? Like this is something where we should just be able to print it. And I'm pretty sure in 20 years, we'll look back on what we did today as about as laughably quaint as what we were doing with computers 20 years ago. And for the same reasons, right? It's the same feedback system. So, solar's coming soon to a place near you. Just to put this in context, I think the final numbers aren't in yet, but I think last year, globally, we deployed 463 gigawatts of solar power. So for reference, that is the 1 megawatt solar array we've been talking about. It's about 5 acres of solar every minute. Right. It's an astonishing rate of deployment. The total amount of nuclear power production worldwide that's been built since 1960 something is about 500 and change gigawatts. And obviously the nuclear capacity factor is somewhat higher. It's about 0.9 versus 0.25. But the part of the reason we're seeing batteries expand even faster than solar is that there's a positive synergy between batteries and solar. All right, so I kind of noticed that happening. And then much later, kind of became curious about oil and gas and how that industry worked, and read a couple of books on that, and then understood a bit more about how fracking worked. And then I was like, that's interesting. And then at the same time, I started writing this book about building an industrialized, self-sustaining industrialized city on Mars, which had a chapter on supply chain for each of the different fundamental things you need, like concrete and steel and aluminum. Speaking to an Irish person earlier today, and I'm regressing. Aluminum, magnesium.
I won't yell at you for that here. I think you're valid.
Food, water. It is actually aluminium. It's just Americans are wrong, but whatever. I live here now. And also hydrocarbons, because if you want to do self-sustaining industry, you need plastics and you need resins and all kinds of chemicals, pigments, glues, adhesives, all kinds of stuff. And those are all hydrocarbon products. So you need a hydrocarbon supply chain. And you also need to make rocket fuel, which is also a hydrocarbon. So I was like, that's interesting. And it turns out that this actually places a major constraint on your Mars city because it's so energy intensive and energy is so scarce on Mars, it's really hard to get access to it. You might need some enormous solar array on Mars or possibly some kind of nuclear reactor if you can figure out how to make one that will actually work there. But it has to be like gigawatt scale nuclear reactor, gigawatt scale solar array to make this work at any reasonable level. Because, if you're trying to do a self-sustaining city on Mars with just 1 million people, the per capita productivity has to be 10 to 100 times higher than it is here on Earth, which means that per capita consumption of energy has to be 10 to 100 times higher than it is here on Earth. So it's just like mind-boggling quantities of energy. And then I was like, well, if it turns out that energy is really expensive on Mars and that places severe constraints on the ability of a Martian economy to be self-sustaining, but all you need is a lot of energy to make a lot of hydrocarbons, and solar's getting really cheap, I wonder what that means. So I did the math. This sounds like this all happened in one evening. This happened over several months. Did the math on that and realized there was something there that we were pretty close to this critical cost threshold where if solar got cheap enough, just the cheapest way of getting oil and gas would be to make it out of the air. Same as 300 years ago, the cheapest way of getting chemical energy was to go and like farm or like pick some fruit or something like that, or catch an animal. That was pretty exciting. And then I was like, well, I wonder if anyone else has noticed this. And a few people had, but they didn't seem to be approaching the problem of building technology to exploit this emerging fact about the world that had really exciting implications for climate and for human progress in general, like alleviating scarcity of hydrocarbons and energy. They didn't seem to be approaching it in a way that I thought was compatible with like the fastest possible scaling success. And at one point I made the mistake of complaining about this to Patrick Collison. And as usual, in Patrick Collison, you complain to Patrick Collison, he says, well, why didn't you go and fix it then? And again, it took a few months soul searching. I went on a vision quest up into the Sierras and was like trying to figure out what to do with my life, and if I should, basically throw away this career I'd hoped and dreamed for my entire life at JPL to try this out, and then found at 11,000 feet that I had hypoxia and couldn't think very clearly at all, and it was also quite cold, But then eventually decided, yes, it was time to move forward. So I got on with it and raised some money and hired some really top people and built all this stuff.
I would like to dive just like for another minute, a little bit in on the hypoxia moment of decision. I'm sure it didn't happen at the moment of hypoxia, but
yeah.
What tell me a little bit more about on that vision quest, kind of near the final days of what I imagine were not like an easy, exciting decision to go into this. You, like you said, you had a career you loved. What sort of were some of the final thoughts and final things that pushed you over the edge to decide I'm going to go do this?
Well, I would say that like at JPL, I was frustrated in some ways. I'm frustrated in every job, but I was frustrated in some ways. But yeah, on this walk up into the Sierras, a good friend of mine, Moxie Marlinspike, who's the co-founder of Signal, encrypted text messaging. Actually, my wife co-implemented part of that, which is how I know him. Came along, and he's an entrepreneur, and we talked about this stuff. And I said, "What's your advice?" And he's like, "Well, generally speaking, if someone's not working out, they don't like magically start to work out again in the future. It's best to prune early and often." And I was like, "Huh, I'll file that away." But if you talk to an entrepreneur who's actually done it, particularly in the hardware tech space, they will tell you that if you need to be convinced to go and do it, you probably shouldn't do it because it does involve a lot of unnecessary and voluntary pain and hardship. But at the same time, it's also extremely liberating. I really feel like I'm learning and growing, and every single person on this team is spending all their time becoming as smart as they possibly can on what will be the biggest industry ever, regardless of how Terraform ends up going in that fight. We're building this kind of fundamental human infrastructure, which I'm very excited by. So I do not regret it at all. In retrospect, I should have jumped at least a year earlier. I would be a year further ahead now, maybe even further. Maybe it'd be easier to raise money back then. I don't know. On the other hand, raising money in the last year has been a good learning experience, and it's also forced us to think really carefully about what we want to prioritize. And I've seen a number of startups essentially fail because they did not need to have adequate financial discipline. So I think you just have to do the best you can with what you got. That's what we're doing here. But yeah, I was up in the mountains, went up above Horseshoe Meadow, up to 11,000 feet, and normally I can handle altitude quite well, but it was, it was a very, very long, cold night, and staring at the stars, which are quite beautiful, and I don't know, like I wasn't feeling altitude sick or anything, but I just wasn't thinking my clearest thoughts. But I at that point I'd already made my decision pretty much. I was just, looking to go forward.
Very cool. To date, you've been working on the company for about 2 years.
Yep.
What has been the hardest technical challenge you guys have overcome, and how did you kind of engineer around it?
That is a good question. I would say I can't answer that question directly because I can't actually think of a technical challenge that really like set us on our ass for a long period of time. What I will say is that we've come across numerous smaller technical challenges, and yes, there were big technical challenges of previous companies that I've encountered and will one day speak to. Actually, unfortunately, Hyperloop officially finally died recently, and there is a story to be told there, but not here. But back to Terraform, we have encountered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of say, quite interesting technical problems, and in every single case, we have found that we are overthinking the problem. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? It requires you to adjust the way that you think about problems, and in general, we see this in other areas as well. There are a handful of human endeavors where it is necessary to go all out on complexity, and humans can do that, and we have the tooling to do that, and we can use finite element analysis and computational analysis, and you can go and get a room full of PhDs, and you can work out your way through some horrendously complex system. And one good example of that would probably be like photolithography for advanced chips or something like that. But in almost all other fields of endeavor, particularly in startup land, you are best served by boiling something down to the absolute essence. And as I like to say, you just got to do the dumbest possible thing. Like just do it the simplest possible way you can possibly imagine. If you look at the major technology improvements between the first generation Tesla cars, like the Model S and Model X, and the later ones, the Model 3 and Model Y, it has been to simplify the system. If you look at the difference between the original Falcon 1, then the original Falcon 9 and the current Falcon 9, it is much simpler. Yes, there are a handful of little components where they've said, this thing, we cannot buy ourselves a solution simply. We have to add a lot of complexity. But in general, the system as a whole, you take out interdependency, you take out complexity, you make it as simple as possible.
This might sound like a weird question, but
I love them.
How can you try to describe how you think? And what I mean by that, to add a little bit of specificity, is maybe when you encounter a problem, what are some of your brain's and knee-jerk kind of mental responses? Or are there any kind of common mental lenses that you find yourself looking through the world at a lot?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been a tremendous privilege to get to work here and think deeply about energy for a long time. So I find that when I'm approaching an energy problem, I have a series of heuristics that can, basically humans think quickly by analogy and often wrongly, but quickly. But at least because I've thought about these problems in some depth, I can often, bring some insights or some additional, alternative perspectives to the problem that other people may be unfamiliar with. And together we can make a lot of progress. And I've applied those same sorts of methods in the past to analyzing this kind of Mars City problem, or when I was at Hyperloop, to basically understanding everything there was to know about particularly passive maglev systems. I got to file that away somewhere. I'm sure it'll be useful. And then obviously in grad school, gravitational wave generation from black hole binary and spirals, amongst other things. So if you spend a long time with a problem, you kind of get to know it quite well. And actually right now I'm working on other problems as well in my copious free time. So it's always fun to kind of dig in. But I'd say that the one thing that I do, that I think that I do really, really well, that is unfortunately quite rare, even amongst people who've had STEM training, is the way that I was taught to solve physics problems when I did the physics Olympiad in high school. And it's not a secret. I've written a blog post about it, and I'm in the process of trying to figure out how to write a physics textbook which embodies these ideals for the busy professional, right? This is not the physics textbook that is designed to get some barely scraping a pass high schooler through first year physics and convince them that physics is cool, right? This is the sort of thing where if you're already bought into the idea that physics is cool, but you made the mistake of not studying physics in college, but you kind of can work your way around a spreadsheet or Python, or you can do a bit of calculus, you can pick this book up and immediately, in afternoons of reading, get an additional knowledge of the fundamental theorems and the fundamental ideas across all of physics. And then later on, if you've got more details, you can go into a bit more detail. But I want it to be a small book. I want it to be concise. I want it to be beautiful. I think I'm going to have it'll be about this big with big margins for notes, and there'll just be some diagrams and text, and there'll be 1 page per concept kind of thing, maybe 2 pages per concept, something like that. But essentially, the method, which is described in the blog post, is step 1: you draw a diagram. When you draw a diagram, you are loading the problem into your GPU. That is the key. Everything else is details. You draw a diagram that accurately captures the essence of the problem, and then you add some infrastructure to the diagram to reduce the odds of making a mistake. So you label which way is up and which way is across there, and if you're using symbols and stuff, you define what the symbols are with arrows. And then at this point, if you're solving a physics problem in school and you've just drawn a diagram that successfully translates the question into diagrammatic form, together with sensible nomenclature and so on, you're damn close to hitting a pass, right? To achieve a pass, you only need to do one more step, which is diagnosis. You just need to diagnose what sort of problem it is. What method are you going to use to solve this problem? There's about 20 different methods across physics. There's obviously methods in other fields that I'm less familiar with. Things like conservation principles, force balance principle, whatever it may be. Just coordinate bash, whatever. And then after that, it's just details. It's like writing down equations and solving equations, which is a mechanical process that you're good at or you're not. But if you're well-resourced enough, you can figure out how to do it, or you can ask someone to do it for you, or ChatGPT can do it for you. And then when you get the answer, again, doing some basic checks to make sure you haven't made a dumb mistake. And that's it. That's it. But, if you do this, I think it is fair to say that Elon Musk is the most famous proponent of thinking this way. And he hasn't described this algorithm in this way, but I'm pretty sure that he would probably agree with the basics of what I'm saying here. But this is why the Falcon 1 and the Falcon 9 look boring, right? This is why the first and second stage use the same engine and the same fuel, the same avionics package, right? They're just stretched versions of each other. And that is why the Falcon 9 is the cheapest rocket by far of its class and scale ever built, even ignoring the reusability factor. Right? It's because he's like, well, why would I make these two parts different sizes if I could make them the same size? Particularly for a rocket where you've got a lot of loads are being transmitted up through the skin. So if you want to change the size of the second stage because it gives you a 4% mass benefit or something, you end up with a big mass penalty because you have to create this extremely hard to machine and construct cone to transmit the forces from one. Anyway, it blows my mind. But Garfield's law is alive and well. I think it's Garfield's law, the one that says that the product is a map of the org chart of the organization that built it.
I've never heard that. That's actually really interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
So when you look at NASA's rockets, so you look at the SLS, for example, it's basically just a map of the key constituencies that NASA's not allowed to annoy.
It's been 25 minutes and we're already talking mess about NASA's.
Yeah, it's shit talking SLS. And whereas you can tell that the Tesla cars and the SpaceX rockets are all built in the same factory by the same organization, run by the same people. There's no obvious interfaces that are you can the lawyers are involved here.
What are some technologies? I think I know one answer you might give here.
Yeah.
What are some technologies, though, or a technology or research that you think in the next 5, 10 years will have, maybe even 15 to increase the timescale, but have a really big impact on humanity, or could, if applied in a certain way? Or
Yeah. Well, the major growth areas, well, obviously AI, but I'll leave that to other people to talk about. I'm very excited by that. On the climate front, there are 3 key technologies that I'm going to talk about so that I can help popularize these ideas. The first is solar radiation management, which essentially says that the easiest way for us to avoid catastrophically destabilizing the climate in the short term while we let stuff we're working on here work in the long term is to inject a little bit of sulfur into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere. We already know how to do this. It's astonishingly cheap. Volcanoes do it naturally, but we can't rely on a volcano to save us at this point. And actually, the process of desulfurizing, in particular, fuels used in shipping and also coal used in power generation, is the key driver of the increase of the effects of global warming that we are seeing. Because prior to the desulfurization of fuels, the sulfur that was being emitted by burning sulfurized fuels was masking the effects of global warming. It was also causing acid rain that was like bad for people's lungs and bad for plants and things. But actually, if we take a little bit of the sulfur that we've taken out of the fuel and we inject it into the stratosphere, it basically sits up there for maybe 100 times longer, maybe a year instead of a few days. And so the amount of acid rain it generates is 100 times smaller, and it's also evenly spread over the entire Earth instead of being concentrated in the immediate vicinity of some horribly polluting factory. So it's essentially not a major concern. It's not a concern at all, as far as I'm concerned. Certainly less overall acid rain impingement than that caused by legacy emission of existing ground-based sulfurized fuel burning infrastructure. And we can essentially continue to emit it just as much as we need every year, just to keep the lid on the temperature, right? 1.5 degrees, we can probably live with. 2.5 degrees, it's going to be a really bad day for people who don't have money, right? Let's be clear here. The primary impacts of climate change are not going to fall on people like you and me who can afford air conditioning and cars and insurance and live in a place that's not right by the ocean. It's going to fall on the people who already have so little and who we want to work so hard to bring them and their lives and their children's lives into the modern era. So we should absolutely do that. The second thing is, what do we do about the legacy CO2 emissions that we've, about 2 trillion tons of CO2 over the last couple of hundred years, and one of those just in the last 50? And the answer to that is we have to aggressively capture that and put it into the crust, take it out of the atmosphere somehow. And by far the cheapest way of doing that is enhanced weathering, which essentially amounts to a very, very large industrialized effort to select a mountain or a set of mountains, but roughly one mountain of material somewhere in a warm, shallow equatorial sea, grind it up into flour, and then dump it into the ocean, where it will absorb CO2 out of the ocean that is naturally absorbed into the ocean through rainfall, and then take it out of circulation. And this is something we should be actively ramping up now. It'll take probably a decade or two to get to scale, but that will just operate until we have sucked down 1 trillion tons of carbon, and then we can turn it off and it's done. And then the third step is obviously what we're working on here, which is infinite carbon neutral, non-climate enhancing, non-climate damaging, cheap, relatively non-toxic hydrocarbons for every man, woman, and child on Earth forever, no questions asked. So you don't need to have preferential access to Saudi Arabia or the Gulf region. You don't need to have giant oil tankers going around the world causing problems and environmental catastrophes and pollution. You just throw out some solar panels in your local neighborhood and can convert that immediately to obviously electricity, but also to the chemicals that our society depends on locally. No strategic problems. No nothing.
So 3 of those problems, one is taken by Casey and Terraform. The other 2, we have a volcanic causing startup. You could have really great naming, marketing.
There's a company actually doing that called Make Sunsets. So check them out. They're very
eats mountains, and they want to.
There's a handful of companies out there looking at enhanced weathering, but I think that has to be the sort of thing where Act of Congress says, here's a lot of money, go and do this.
Yeah, I don't see a way that you can make that work with capitalism very easily.
No, because certainly it's true that there's a voluntary carbon market, and it's probably in the millions of tons per year, but we need to take down 1 trillion tons. And the voluntary carbon market doesn't stretch that far. It's pretty comprehensive now. In particular, the most polluting industries. So Apple can easily offset all their carbon because they don't pollute very much carbon, and the revenue they earn per ton of carbon they emit is much, much more than it costs to capture that carbon and sequester it. But almost all of the carbon is emitted by the extremely energy-intensive industries that we still depend on and that are very important for us, like making cement and making food and keeping us warm and not too cold. And the revenue per unit carbon that they earn is so low that they cannot possibly afford to offset that carbon. So you have to put the carbon capture upstream of the of the value generation, which is what we're doing here. You have to generate the carbon in order to make the fuel. When you pay for the fuel, you're paying for the carbon capture. It's not some like tax tacked on after the fact. Right. So those on the climate front, those are the three technologies. And then there's another bucket, which is like solar is this incredible energy source in general. What else can you use that for? And so again, you look at all those incredibly energy intensive industries, and that includes making steel, making cement, heating, cooling, seasonal power storage, daily power storage, refining silicon, obviously, light metal refining, so aluminum, magnesium, et cetera, all these different processes, making various fertilizers and so on, extremely energy intensive, and almost all of them will ultimately find their ultimate source of energy to be solar in the near or distant future. I'd say most likely in the next 20 years. And although those industries are quite large, they're nowhere near as large as the hydrocarbon industry, obviously, but individually, any of those industries could support 100 extremely lucrative startups. So this is not like, well, SpaceX did really well and they captured the entire like commercial launch market worldwide and they earned $1 billion a year. Well done. There's not much room for anyone else, maybe Rocket Lab and one other. But these are industries that are significantly larger. Like actually chemicals in aggregate is in the many trillions of dollars a year. So, there's plenty of room there. Cement industry is, I'm going to say, in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year at least. So, there's plenty of opportunity.
What's something that people don't ask you about Terraform or even maybe consider about Terraform enough that you wish people thought about or asked you about more?
That is a good question. Part of the reason that I like speaking to people like you is I think it is underappreciated in general just how hard it is to make stuff in general. And we're surrounded here by an incredible bounty, right? Like even people 20 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, could not imagine the ease. It's so trivial for us to build this stuff because we can open up an internet-connected catalog, press a button, and that stuff arrives that same afternoon using a completely painless automatic payments method intermediated by virtual credit cards with automatic fraud protection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just absolutely absurd. But even then, even with all this technology, actually making stuff like cell phones, for example, cell phones are just magic. Right? Look at this thing. What the hell? It's got like every single element in the periodic table, except the radioactive ones, is in this doing something fancy that I don't understand. Like just try and imagine the paths of all the individual electrons inside this phone. Like speaking of Vision Quest, like what the hell? Like there's no one human on Earth, not even 1,000 humans on Earth could understand every last detail of how a phone works.
And we all have them.
We all have them, and they cost almost nothing. They cost so little that if a new phone comes out and I have $1,000 in my wallet, I feel actively burdened by that cash. So I just want to, give me the phone. Actually, I don't. I keep my phones until they break. But some people I know like to do that. And the same thing goes here, that we take it for granted that when we go to the gas station, there's our gas. And we turn on the stove, there's our gas. When we turn on the heater, there's our gas. Actually, gas can mean two different things in American English. But from the gas station, you get gasoline or octane, which is a liquid form of hydrocarbon. And the other form of gas, natural gas, is methane, which is gaseous at room temperature. But people don't have any inkling of what it takes to get that. And we actually see that right now in California. Unfortunately, a series of policies have been put into place that make it extremely difficult to drill and to extract oil and gas from California, which is one of the world's great oil producing areas. Los Angeles Basin is the third largest oil producing basin in the United States. And also the by far most environmentally regulated and stringent oil and gas generating area on Earth. So the oil and gas that's produced from California is by far the cleanest in terms of both global and local impacts. And because it's become so hard to get oil and gas here, California has to import more and more and more from the Middle East, where there's essentially no environmental regulation, on giant oil tankers that pollute the whole way across the ocean, which is really huge. If you've ever sailed across it, even flown across it, the ocean is goddamn huge. And they sit off the port of Long Beach, spewing out pollution, poisoning the underprivileged communities in that area, day after day after day, because essentially of an aesthetic preference to not have the dirty industry of oil and gas, which we all depend on here in California. Now, in 10 years, it's a moot point because Terraform Industries and friends will be synthesizing all that oil and gas anyway, and it'll be locally produced, and the oil tankers will no longer be coming. But it just underlines and emblemizes how little even our representatives understand about the importance of the factors of production that keep us all alive. It's not like this stuff is secret. Adam Smith wrote this stuff down a long time ago. I think just more people need to appreciate that, if you like stuff, you have to make stuff. You need factories. You need factories to make things. And so, yeah, we got a factory here making stuff.
last question for you. Actually, pre-last question. I just
Ultimate.
I just thought of this one, but I'm curious because it should be one of the standard questions I ask on this. But
We're a prototype here, just to be clear.
true. I think a lot about, like, my whole reason for doing S3 is because I want to try to inspire more people, especially younger people who like spend a lot of time on phones and technology and consuming stuff, and maybe, I don't know, aren't doing stuff that might have a reciprocal value back. Not to put any of that judgment on people, but how do you think we go about inspiring more of the population, or like, what is the approach? Like, just like, what is the right question to ask about getting more of the population trying to think bigger than themselves? And I'm not talking about people in a survival state. I'm talking about people who can ask the luxury to do whatever they want.
It's not for everyone to make things, but making things it's a calling. It's almost a priesthood in a way. Having the skills and the knowledge to take an idea and turn it into an embodied prototype in your hand that does a thing that no one ever did before, nothing ever saw before, and then produce so many of them so cheaply that millions of people can enjoy them, particularly as an embodied form. Like, software is great. Like, software is zero marginal cost. We've kind of seen that most recent cycle come to completion in the last few months. But hardware, I think, is the next big thing, because we haven't dematerialized the process of producing hardware yet. It's still, I like to say that, like, we figured out how to mass produce cars 100 years ago. We figured out how to mass produce a few other things, computers in particular, but we have not yet figured out a general solution for mass production for anything. Every single thing that you see mass produced, whether it's the cameras we're speaking through, whatever, has a custom designed by lots of very smart people process for producing that thing that does not really generalize outside of that process. And you can watch the videos of the tours of Tesla's factories, and Sandy Munro, for example, does these incredible teardowns and discussions of how manufacturing occurs, and you can read books about it. And it really gives you an appreciation that, like, actually having the ability to turn raw materials into magic in our hands is a really powerful thing. I think the guys in the Gundo have the right idea about, like, proselytizing that vision for, like, if you have a vision for the future that is ideally positive and inclusive and is better for all of humans, and you want to see that come about, and that vision for the future includes things that are not happening on their own, which is to say things that are not yet making money, but they might make money, then you can create a startup to provide those things, to build those things and make them happen. And there are so many opportunities. There's so many things that people have just dreamed about, that my parents and their parents' generation dreamed about, and now it's kind of in our hands that we can do this. There's 2024. We can build the goddamn future here. Like, just because we live twice as long as our ancestors does not mean that we have to take twice as long to build things. We can build them quickly and we can get there. So I think more people need to realize that. And actually, the maker movement is a really important part of that. 3D printers is an important part of that. You can actually, like, 3D printed things in general are not, like, don't have super high utility compared to, mass-produced phones or something. But just to get your feet wet, just to, like, realize that you can actually turn an idea into a real thing that impresses you or entertains your friends.
My last question for you then. As I said, that answer got me fired up. What is your current life philosophy? Easy question,
Yeah, easy question. Well, I have to say that I'm enjoying having children a lot more than I thought I would. I think that I grew up in the shadow of Paul Ehrlich's, like, The Population Bomb book, and well-meaning people all over were concerned about overpopulation, so you worry about the burden of children, then you worry about the burden of being unable to provide for them, in particular because of housing shortage. But I earlier started a rant about, like, how crazy immigration policy is. We should make it a lot easier for people, particularly highly qualified people, to immigrate to the United States. But at the same time, like, this neighborhood here is surrounded by houses that were built for returning GIs after the Second World War as your, like, $50,000 starter home with, a lot of asbestos in them. And now they're selling for $2 million because it's the best thing we had in LA. And it's not like we forgot how to make houses. Houses are old technology. We've known how to make houses for 10,000 years, right? We just decided for some reason that, like, fuck it, we'll stop making houses and see what happens. Well, we've seen what happens. Housing becomes completely unaffordable. People the world over stop having children, and then we have this aging population because, in the last 80 years, the median age of a population has gone from about 25 to about 50. That's a catastrophe. Like, this is an unsolvable problem unless we liberalize house building regulations, like, immediately, allow a lot of immigration of particularly younger and more qualified people from overseas, and ideally solve immortality, which would, take the pressure off at the other end. So that's a major thing. To my surprise, I found children are great, and just had my third child. And if I'd known now how much I was going to enjoy having kids, especially given how much all the parents I knew moaned and groaned about how terrible kids were, like what do they know? It's great that I would have had many, many more of them if I'd started younger. So I think Elon says a lot of strange things, but I think he's absolutely right about the coming demographic catastrophe. And actually, as far as demographics go, it is a massive humanitarian crisis that so many people get old and die. I don't know if no doubt many of your listeners and you yourself have encountered like death of a loved one or relative or something as they get old. And for sure, for some people, they're ready, right? They've had a good life and they're ready to go. But for a lot of people, they're not ready to go. We're not ready to see them go. They get taken from us anyway, for reasons that are, of course, beyond our control in an evolutionary sense. But we have this technology. We've already figured out how to double or triple our lifespan. We should damn well figure out how to slow down aging by a factor of 10. I don't think it'll be all that hard in retrospect when we figure it out. And as I said, it'll take the pressure off. And it'll solve the population problem as well. Because if you live for 1,000 years, it doesn't matter if you have a kid every 20 years. There's plenty of time to have enough kids. Right now, we're on the clock. You got to somehow earn enough money to buy a house by the time you're 35 or you're out. This is fucking stupid. We should stop doing this. So my current life philosophy is kids are great. Kids are great because they represent a future that has better lives and better hope than the one that you got to enjoy. And I have to say my life has been pretty good, but my children's life will be, I'm sure, even better. And then I get to spend my days when they're at school, building bits and pieces of the technology that will help make their life and the life of a billion or so other children much, much better in the future. So yeah, that's good. That do?
Build companies, make babies.
Yeah. Read scrolls.
Read scrolls.
Read scrolls. Yeah.
Also important.
Also important.
Very good. Casey, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. That'll do it.
I'm so strung out. I think this is why Lex Friedman does like the really long form podcast.